Hegel offers us strong statements of two views about action that starkly contrast with and stand in at least apparent tension with each other. First, a broadly behaviorist, externalist view, which identifies and individuates actions according to what's actually done, the performance that's produced. Here we could think of Anscombe's "I do what happens." And the second is an intentionalist, internalist view, which identifies and individuates actions by the agent's intention or purpose in undertaking them. According to the first view, the inner can only be understood in terms of its outer expression. So it makes no sense to think of intentions as states whose content is related only contingently to, and so can diverge radically from, that of the performances to which they give rise. Quote, action simply translates an initially implicit being into a being that's made explicit. Consciousness must act merely in order that what it is in itself may become explicit for it. An individual cannot know what he is until he has made himself a reality through action. Again a quote, the deed is the actual self. The agent only gets to know his end from the deed. The deed does away with the inexpressibility of what is meant. End of the quotes. If the content of the inner intention is settled by what is true of the actual external performance that expresses it, then it's epistemically available even to the agent only retrospectively. Long quote. Therefore, feelings of exaltation or lamentation or repentance are altogether out of place. For all that sort of thing stems from a mind which imagines a content and an in itself which are different from the original nature of the individual and the actual carrying out of it in the real world. Whatever it is that the individual does and whatever happens to him, that he has done himself, and he is that himself. He can have only the consciousness of the simple transference of himself from the night of possibility into the daylight of the present, from the abstract in itself into the significance of actual being. The analysis of this being into intentions and subtleties of that sort, whereby the actual man, i.e. his deed, is to be explained away again in terms of a being that is only meant, just as the individual himself even may create for himself special intentions concerning his actuality, all of this must be left to the laziness of mere conjecture. End of that quote. And a final index passage expressing this perspective explicitly maintains that the point is not affected by acknowledging the possibility of failure. Quote, from what has now been said, we may learn what to think of a man who, when blamed for his shortcomings, or it may be his discreditable acts, appeals to the professedly excellent intentions and sentiments of the inner self he distinguishes therefrom. There certainly may be individual cases where the malice of outward circumstances frustrates well-meant designs and disturbs the execution of the best-laid plans. But in general, even here, the essential unity between inward and outward is maintained. We're thus justified in saying that a man is what he does, and the lying vanity which consoles itself with the feeling of inward excellence may be confronted with the words of the gospel, by their fruits ye shall know them. That grand saying applies primarily in a moral and religious aspect, but it holds good in reference to performances in art and science. If a daub of a painter or a poetaster soothe themselves by the conceit that their head is full of high ideals, their consolation is a poor one. And if they insist on being judged not by their actual works, but by their projects, we may safely regard their pretensions as unfounded and unmeaning. End of the quote. Hegel wants to bring into view a sense in which a bad painting, poem, or novel cannot be understood as the botched execution of some fine aim or plan, but must be understood rather as showing exactly what its creator actually intended, however it may seem to its author. Just how we're to understand this in the light of the acknowledged possibility of such contingencies as slips of the brush remain to be seen. But the perspective Hegel seeks to put in place here is not just a casual literary flourish or a mistake we are eventually to see through. It's an absolutely central and essential feature of the model of expression, making the implicit explicit, that plays such a crucial role in structuring his understanding of the relations between the subjective and the objective in both intention and cognition. It's also clear, though, that this is not the whole story. There are, he says, two aspects possessed by practical consciousness: intention and deed, what is meant or intended by the deed, and the deed itself, and each must be given its due. Quote, "It's the right of the will to recognize as its action, Handlung, and to accept responsibility for only those aspects of its deed, Tat, which it knew to be presupposed within its end, and which were present in its purpose, Vorsatz. I can be accountable for a deed only if my will was responsible for it. This is the right of knowledge." Elsewhere, Hegel makes the same point under the heading of the right of intention. Quote, "So far as the action comes into immediate touch with existence, my part in it is to this extent formal, that external existence is also independent of the agent. This externality can pervert his action and bring to light something else than lay in it. Now, although any alteration as such which is set on foot by the subject's action is its deed, still the subject does not for that reason recognize it as its own action, Handlung, but only admits as its own that existence in the deed which lay in its knowledge and will, and which was its purpose. Only for that does it hold itself responsible." End of the quote. Indeed, distinguishing within the action some elements for which the agent is responsible from others for which the agent is not responsible is one of the principal achievements of modernity. He says, quote, the heroic self-consciousness, as in ancient tragedies like that of Oedipus, had not yet progressed from its unalloyed simplicity to reflect on the distinction between Tat and Handlung, deed and action, between the external event and the purpose and knowledge of the circumstances, or to analyze the consequences minutely, but accepts responsibility for the deed in its entirety. End of the quote. By the end of the phenomenology, Hegel's going to be recommending the reachievement of this ancient heroic conception of total responsibility, inflected, though, through the lessons of modernity. I'm not going to talk about that today, but that's the topic of my third lecture, is what he means and why he thinks reachieving this heroic conception is the way forward. The distinction between Tat and Handlung is the distinction between what's done as an actual event or process, something that happens, and those features in virtue of which it's a doing, something normatively imputable to the agent. This latter is what Hegel calls, quote, the first determinate characteristic of an action, that in its externality it must be known to me as my action, end of the quote. What makes what's done, the deed, mine, that is an action, rather than just something that happens, is its relation to a purpose. For the concept of action includes, quote, the right that the content of the action as carried out in immediate existence shall be in principle mine, thus that the action shall be the purpose, Vorsatz, of the subjective will, end of the quote. The passages concerning the identity of content of the outer deed and the inner state it expresses that I rehearsed above invoke the intention, the Absicht, expressed rather than the purpose. So corresponding, at least roughly, to the Tat-Handlung distinction in Hegel's account is an Absicht-Vorsatz distinction. The content of the feature of an action that Hegel calls its purpose need not extend to everything the developed deed contains, while the content of the feature of an action that Hegel calls its intention does extend to everything the developed deed expressing it contains. The distinction among features of the deed that's induced by the purpose is what determines the deed as the agent's doing, in the normative sense of being something the agent is responsible for. What the agent thereby becomes responsible for doing is the whole deed, everything that's done. And that fully developed deed reveals an intention that extends beyond what's merely meant or purposed. Now, so far I've offered a sketch of some of the most general features of the idiom that Hegel develops to talk about practical agency. I haven't yet tried to say anything about how we should understand these distinctions and claims and what might entitle one to talk that way. It'll be best to elaborate in stages this complex view of agency as a process of expression, development, and objective actualization, in terms of which we're to understand Hegel's distinctive notion of the content that action expressively translates from a subjective or implicit to an objective or explicit form. At the most basic level, I think it ought to be understood as having a Davidsonian structure. There are 5 basic elements in David's theory of action that seem to me helpful in beginning to understand Hegel's. I should say parenthetically, Michael Quanta is the one who has developed in most detail the idea that the analogy between Davidson's views on action and Hegel's. I'm going to argue that he stops too soon, that you have to look at the ways in which Hegel goes beyond Davidson, but he's right as far as it goes. So I think we can start with 5 basic elements in Davidson's way of talking about events as the performances that result from exercise of agency, according to which first, one and the same event can be described or specified in many ways. Further, second point, one important way of identifying or singling out an event is in terms of its causal consequences. So, in Davidson's example, moving one's finger, flipping the switch, turning on the light, and alerting the burglar can all count as specifications of one and the same event. As the effects of an event unfold, each new concentric ripple surrounding it makes available new ways of specifying it by the causal contribution it made to the occurrence of those later events. It's simply not yet settled whether the investment I made yesterday will eventually be identifiable as, say, the wisest financial decision I ever made, or the most foolish. We'll just have to await the results. Davidson calls the way the potential descriptions of an event expand with the passage of time the accordion effect. Third Davidsonian claim, some, but not all of the descriptions of an action may be privileged in that they're ones under which it's intentional. Flipping the switch and turning on the light were intentional, where alerting the burglar, of whom I was unaware, was not. Buying a bond issued by company XYZ was intentional, while buying a bond issued by a company that would go bankrupt the following week, which might be a description of the very same event, would not have been intentional. Fourth Davidsonian point. What makes an event, performance, or process an action, something done, is that it's intentional under some description. Alerting the burglar and buying the bond of a soon-to-be bankrupt company are things genuinely done, even though they were not intentional under those descriptions. For they were intentional under other descriptions of the very same event, namely turning on the light and buying the XYZ bond. The performance is an action under all its descriptions and specifications, including the distant, unforeseeable, consequential ones that come in under the accordion principle. So whether something is an action or not is an extensional matter. But what makes it an action is that it was intentional under some specifications. That's an intentional with an S, that is a specification relative affair. Fifth Davidsonian point. What distinguishes some descriptions as ones under which a performance was intentional is their role as conclusions in processes of practical reasoning. Turning on the light, buying an XYZ bond were things I had reasons to do, provided by ends, purposes, or goals I endorse, commitments I acknowledge, or values I embrace. Those reasons, in the form of ends, purposes, goals, commitments, or values, provide premises for potential pieces of practical reasoning, justifying the practical conclusion that I ought to bring about an event satisfying a description, such as there being a turning on of the light or a buying of the XYZ bond, but not being an alerting of a burglar or a buying of a bond of an incipiently bankrupt company. That securing the applicability of those descriptions is in this way practically justifiable is what makes them the ones under which what I go on to do is intentional, and hence something that counts as an action. The structure of such a Davidsonian account is quite different from one that identifies 3 distinct kinds of event standing in sequential causal relations: prior internal intentions or states of intending, then actions, and then consequences of those actions. The place of distinct events or occurrences of intendings and consequences, which you get on, for instance, Jaegwon Kim's theory of agency and events rather than Davidson's, The place of distinct events or occurrences of intendings and consequences has been taken in the Davidsonian structure by different descriptions of the one thing done. There are intentional and consequential ways of picking out the very same doing. That's why it makes no sense to talk about an intention apart from what was done intentionally. What qualifies an occurrence as an action, something an agent is responsible for, is the existence of a privileged subset of specifications. And they're privileged precisely by their normative relation to the agent. Specifically, they're justified by practical reasons whose normative force or validity the agent acknowledges. My first interpretive suggestion, then, is that Hegel's Tat refers to the deed done with all of its accordion descriptions, and that his Handlung is the same deed as the agent's doing, that is, as specifiable by the restricted set of descriptions under which it's intentional, and hence is something that's done at all. Here's a crucial passage of Hegel that puts together a number of these Davidsonian theses. Quote, "Action has multiple consequences insofar as it's translated into external existence. For the latter, by virtue of its context and external necessity, develops in all directions. These consequences, as the shape whose soul is the end to which the action is directed, belong to the action as an integral part of it. But the action as the end translated into the external world is at the same time exposed to external forces, which attach to it things quite different from what it is for itself, and impel it on into remote and alien consequences. Thus, will has the right to accept responsibility only for the first set of consequences, since they alone were part of its purpose." Vorsatz. End of the quote. Endorsement of the accordion principle, and so of the first and second Davidsonian principles, is implicit in saying that the action's consequences, the action as an external existence developing in all directions, are an integral part of the action itself. The deed is what the action is in itself. But what the action is for itself, or for the acting consciousness, is determined by the subjectively envisaged end or goal it serves, the purpose for which it's performed. In Davidsonian terms, the purpose settles the specifications under which it's intentional, principle 3, which are the ones in virtue of which the deed is recognizable as the agent's, that's principle 4, in the sense that they're the ones in virtue of which the agent is responsible for what's done. This is what Hegel calls the right of knowledge, distinctive of modern conceptions of agency, by contrast with those presented in ancient tragedy that Hegel adverted to in the Oedipus passage I quoted before. So considerations of responsibility induce a distinction within the consequential specifications of the actual performance produced. The end or purpose endorsed, that's the Davidsonian principle 5, is translated into the external world in the shape of the deed, in the sense that the purpose it justifies provides the descriptions of the very same deed that also has those consequential descriptions under which it's not intentional. Hegel says, quote, "The deed posits an alteration to this given existence, and the will is entirely responsible for it, insofar as the predicate mine attaches to the existence so altered. But responsibility involves only the wholly external judgment as to whether I have done something or not, and the fact that I'm responsible for something does not mean that that thing can be imputed to me. That is, the deed is what I do under all its descriptions, and I'm responsible for it in the sense that it's mine. I did it. But it's imputed to me only under the intentional descriptions, the ones appearing in a specification of my purpose, the descriptions that specify the deed as something I had reason to do, the Handlung. Indeed, it's just the failure to appreciate this point about the necessary unity of action, the expression or translation of the inner and the outer, as the actualization of the purpose, in that intentional specifications and unintentional consequential ones specify the same actual deed. It's the failure to appreciate that characterizes the defective forms of modern practical self-consciousness, which are the ones Hegel rehearses in the Reason chapter. In a summary passage, he says, quote, "Consciousness, therefore, through its experience, in which it should have found its truth, has really become a riddle to itself. The consequences of its deed are for it not the deeds themselves. What befalls it is for it not the experience of what it is in itself. The transition is not a mere alteration of the form of the same content and essence, presented now as the content and essence, and again as the object or outwardly beheld essence of itself. End of the quote. For the consequences of the deeds to be the deeds themselves is just for the accordion principle to apply. For what befalls consciousness, the consequential specifications of its deed under which it's not intentional, to be for consciousness, what practical consciousness is in itself, is for the specifications under which the deed is intentional, specifications in terms of its endorsed purpose, expressing the agent's taking responsibility for its doing. It's for those specifications to be acknowledged as specifications of the very same deed that also has external consequential descriptions. Hegel calls the unity that action exhibits as concept and content the Sache selbst. The concept of action, the norm according to which it's assessed as such, when adequately conceived, is the concept of a unified content that's expressed in action, not only in spite of the disparity of form between the action as implicit, as thought or intended, and as explicit in actuality or what's accomplished, which is what's meant by the contingency of action, but the unity of action as itself consisting in its relation between those disparate moments. He says, quote, long quote, "The Sache selbst is only opposed to these moments insofar as they're supposed to be isolated, but as an interfusion of the reality and the individuality, it is essentially their unity. It's equally an action and qua-action pure action in general, hence just as much an action of this particular individual," that's the Einigkeit. "And this action, as still his in antithesis to reality, is a purpose. Equally, it's the transition from this determinateness into the opposite. And lastly, it's a reality which is explicitly present for consciousness. The Sache selbst thus expresses the spiritual essentiality in which all these moments have lost all validity on their own and are valid therefore only as universal, and in which the certainty consciousness has of itself, what it is for itself, is an objective entity, an objective fact for it, an object born of self-consciousness as its own, without ceasing to be a free object in the proper sense." End of quote. The unity or identity of content in contingent action that is the Sache selbst is not the identity of something that is what it is independently. It's a unity forged out of moments of independence and moments of dependence. Contingency, the manifestation of the dependence of the action on the circumstances of the performance and the talents of the doer and the material means available, is somehow to be incorporated integrally into the unity that is the Sache selbst. Now again, I'm setting the criterion of adequacy that Hegel is giving us an account of. I don't pretend to have explained this yet. What he calls the distinction that action implies is that between what is purposed and what is accomplished in the realm of existence. More specifically, when we look at the internal articulation of the process that in its unity we identify as an action, quote, the simple original nature now splits up into the distinction which action implies. Action is present at first as end, and hence is opposed to a reality already given. The second moment is the movement of the end, hence the idea of the transition itself or a means. The third moment is the object, which is no longer in the form of an end directly known by the agent to be his own, but is brought out into the light of day and having for him the form of an other, what's actually done. End of the quote. This broadly Davidsonian understanding of this splitting up of the action can be exploited so as to explain how the deed, unfolding consequentially beyond the ken or compass of the purpose of the agent, can nevertheless be acknowledged by the agent as the agent's doing, so that the agent does not, in its practical activity, become a riddle to itself. Well, how does Hegel understand the difference between the different kinds of what I've been calling descriptions or specifications of the deed? The short version of the answer I'll offer here is, first, that it's a distinction of social perspective between the agent, who acknowledges a specifically contentful responsibility, and an audience who attributes and assesses that responsibility. Second, that difference of social perspective is a normative one in a dual sense. First, what they're a perspective on is a normative status, a question of the imputation of a specific responsibility. And the perspectives are defined by distinct seats of authority concerning the characterization of what the agent is responsible for. Third, the ultimate determinate identity, the unity of the content of action, what we should understand as common to its inner form and its outer, that's inner in the Hegelian sense of implicit, not in the Cartesian sense of epistemically transparent, and that's outer in the Hegelian sense of explicit rather than the Cartesian sense of epistemically opaque. What we should understand as common to the inner and the outer form that translate, actualizes, and expresses that content is for Hegel the product of a process of reciprocal specific recognition in which the competing complementary, socially distinct authorities negotiate and their claims are adjudicated and reconciled. These are all claims in which Hegel moves far beyond anything that's even implicit in Davidson's views. And that's what I want to talk about in the time I have remaining. The distinction that action implies is, on the Davidsonian line that I'm pursuing, a distinction between intentional and consequential characterizations of one and the same deed. We can already see in this way of setting things out the basis for Hegel's claim that ethical theories that assess the rightness of actions exclusively on the basis of intentions with which they're performed, and ethical theories that assess the rightness of action exclusively on the basis of the consequences to which they give rise are equally one-sided and wrong. The two sorts of assessments ought rather to be seen as two sides of one coin, at least in the sense of being reciprocally sense-dependent. And we're now asking after the nature of the whole that necessarily comprises these two aspects of practical activity. The essentially social character of that distinction shows up if we think about who's in a normative position, who has the authority to offer specifications of the two sorts. To say that the deed or the work is actual is to say that it's public, available to all. The truth of the performance, what it is in itself, is expressed in all of the descriptions of what's actually achieved, all the specifications of the content in terms of its consequences. These descriptions are available in principle to anyone in the community to recognize the performance under or to characterize its content. Hegel says the work is, i.e., it exists for other individualities. For others who witness or hear about my action, coming to know about it in any of the various ways we come to know about any actual occurrences, what my deed is, can, as Hegel says, be said of it. He says, quote, "Actualization is a display of what is one's own in the element of universality, whereby it becomes and should become the affair of everyone." Universality here is just the community. The consequential descriptions specify what the action is for others, and for the agent qua other, that is, as recognizing and assessing her own action via her empirical consciousness of it as an actuality. Quote, "The work produced is the reality which consciousness gives itself. It's that in which the individual is explicitly for himself what he is implicitly or in himself, and in such a manner that the consciousness for which the individual becomes explicit in the work is not the particular, but the universal consciousness." End of the quote. What Hegel calls the universal consciousness is that of the community, as opposed to the individual agent. The other members of the community can describe what it is that I've done. They can specify what I've achieved or accomplished. Accordingly, the distinction between what I intended and what I accomplished, between what the performance is for me and what it is in itself, takes the form of the distinction between what it is for me and what it is for others. The actuality available to all is the explicit form of the commitment the agent has undertaken in action. But what makes the commitment, and so the action, the agent's, the moment of certainty, is his acknowledgement of it as such. And for that, the specifications under which the agent endorses it have special authority, not shared by those who merely observe the result of that endorsement. These are the specifications under which it's intentional, the ones that the agent has special authority over. We can look at this notion in terms of its circumstances and consequences of application. What in this distinctive way privileges the association of some descriptions of the deed with the doer is that they're the ones that appear as conclusions of processes of practical reasoning endorsed by the agent. For example, it's dark. I need to see. Turning on the light will enable me to see. Flipping the switch will turn on the light, so I shall flip the switch. The agent's endorsement of such practical reasoning may have been explicitly attached to its actual rehearsal as part of an antecedent process of deliberation leading up to the performance, or it may be implicit in a disposition to trot it out when challenged to give reasons for the performance. The consequences of application of the concept description under which the performance is intentional are that these specify the contents of the commitment the agent takes herself to be acknowledging in producing the performance. The performance is intentional under those descriptions the agent is prepared to acknowledge herself as responsible for it under, apart from any knowledge of the descriptions that become available only with its being actualized, specifically descriptions in terms of its consequences. These are the descriptions under which the agent is petitioning the community to be specifically recognized as responsible for the performance. Both these socially distinguished recognitive elements, the descriptions under which the agent specifically recognizes or acknowledges herself as responsible, and those under which the community specifically recognizes the agent as responsible, both of those are essential to the unity and identity of the action. Hegel discusses this sort of identity and difference, this socially articulated reciprocal specific recognitive achievement, under the rubric of the Sache selbst. The concept of action being invoked is the concept of a unified content that's expressed in action, not only in spite of the disparity of form between the action as implicit in thought or intended and as explicit in actuality or accomplished, but is actually consisting in the relation between those disparate moments that's induced by the social process of reciprocal specific recognition, the acknowledgement and the attribution of a determinately contentful commitment. Hegel says, quote, "The Sache selbst is present as the in itself, or the reflection into itself of consciousness. The supplanting of the moments by one another finds expression there, however, in their being established in consciousness, not as they are in themselves, but only as existing for another consciousness. One of the moments of the content is exposed by it to the light of day and made manifest to others. But consciousness is at the same time reflected back from it into itself, and the opposite is equally present within consciousness, which retains it for itself as its own." End of the quote. It's doings that one is responsible for. Something must be done for it to be intentional under any description. What's done is exposed to the light of day. It's actualized, expressed, made explicit, in the sense of existing for other consciousnesses, being made manifest to others who have authority over the specification of what one has made oneself responsible for. The result is that the agent is specifically recognized by these other subjects. The deed is attributed to the agent under consequential descriptions as the explicit expression of a determinately contentful, implicit commitment. Hegel says what the deed is can be said of it, and the ones for whom it is something that can be said of it are others, for whom it's something actual and observable, like any other fact. The content is what's both acknowledged by the agent and attributed by the community. It's what those social normative perspectives are perspectives on. It's the product of a process of reciprocal recognition. The content of my action, accordingly, does not depend on me alone. It's not just what I take it or make it to be, but depends as well on its determinate acknowledgement by others, who attribute to me responsibility for the performance specified in ways that go beyond those in terms of which I made it mine. Hegel says, quote, "Consciousness experiences both sides as equally essential moments, and in doing so it learns what the nature of the Sache selbst really is, viz. that it's neither merely something which stands opposed to action in general and to individual action. Rather is its nature such that its being is the action of the single individual and of all individuals, and whose action is immediately for others, or as a Sache, and is such only as the action of each and every one, the essence of which is the essence of all beings, viz. Spiritual, geistig essence." The spiritual, in Hegel's usage, is the normative substance that's socially synthesized by the process of reciprocal recognition, which shows up not only as action and work, but also on the cognitive side as experience. The recognitively constituted character of the determinately contentful practical commitments, whose intentional and consequential specifications, its subjective and objective forms, are said to stand in relations of translation, actualization, and expression. The content of those commitments is explicitly acknowledged by and forms the principal progressive insight of the phenomenal form of understanding of agency that Hegel discusses under the heading of conscience. He says, quote, "The existent reality of conscience, however, is one which is a self, an existence which is conscious of itself, the spiritual element of being recognized and acknowledged. The action is thus only the translation of its individual content into the objective element, in which it's universal and recognized, and it's just the fact that it is recognized that makes the deed a reality. The deed is recognized and therefore made real, because the existent reality is directly linked with conviction or knowledge. Or in other words, knowing one's purpose is directly the element of existence, its universal recognition." End of the quote. The Sache selbst is a spiritual expression of individuality compounded out of the moment of independence, or authority, displayed by the particular deliberating self-consciousness in privileging some specifications of its responsibility as descriptions under which the performance is intentional, and the corresponding moment of dependence, or responsibility, on the universal, or assessing consciousness in characterizing it in consequential terms, in characterizing in consequential terms the achievement, and so what one has actually accomplished and is responsible for in that sense. Contingency, the manifestation of the dependence of the action on the circumstances of the performance, the talents of the doer, and the material means available, is to be incorporated integrally into the unity that is the Sache selbst. Hegel's resituating of a generally Davidsonian approach to intentional agency by placing it in the context of a socially perspectival, normative process of reciprocal recognition lets us see how to satisfy one of the principal criteria of adequacy that he articulates for such an account, bringing together into an intelligible whole two aspects of the concept of intentional action that stand in at least apparent tension with one another. These are the unity of an action as it develops from envisaged purpose to completed performance, and what Hegel calls the distinction and dichotomy that lie in action as such, and so constitute its stubborn actuality confronting action. I started off at the beginning with the criteria of adequacy, that you have to be able to understand the doing both as an objective occurrence in the world and as something that's mine. Hegel's now turned the crank on that and moved up to thinking about bringing together the unity, the content that's the same in the objective doing and the doing as intended, and the disparity between them. How can we get those two, the unity and the disparity, together? The unity and necessity of an action are what constitute its identity. He says, quote, "The necessity of the action consists in the fact that purpose is related simply to actuality, and this unity is the begriff of action." End of the quote. Another quote, "Action alters nothing and opposes nothing. It's the pure form of a transition from a state of not being seen to one of being seen. And the content which is brought out into the daylight and displayed is nothing else but what the action already is in itself. Again, Action simply translates an initially implicit being into a being that's made explicit. Or again, the notion of this sphere, the Begriff, requires that these various aspects be grasped in such a way that the content in them remains the same, without any distinction, whether between individuality and being in general, or between end as against individuality as an original nature, or between end and the given reality, or between the means and that reality as an absolute end, or between reality brought about by the agent as against the end, the original nature, or the means. This is the unity of the true work. On the other hand, quote, consciousness in doing its work is aware of the antithesis of doing and being. This disparity between concept and reality, which lies in its essence, is learnt by consciousness from experience in its work. In work, therefore, consciousness becomes what it is in truth. This is the fundamental contradiction inherent in work. Again, the simple original nature now splits up into the distinction which action implies. Action is present first as end and hence opposed to a reality already given. The second moment is the movement of the end, hence the idea of the transition or means. The third moment is the object, which is no longer in the form of an end directly known by the agent to be his own, but is brought out into the light of day and having for him the form of an other. And again, reminding you of passages we've read before, consciousness, therefore, through its experience in which it should have found its truth, has really become a riddle to itself. The consequences of its deeds are not the deeds themselves. What befalls it is for it, not the experience of what it is in itself. The transition is not a mere alteration of the form of the same content and essence, presented now as the content and essence, and again as the object or outwardly beheld essence of itself. The Begriff of action, as Hegel is presenting it, requires something that persists self-identically through it, what he in these passages calls its content, its Inhalt. It's the content that moves from a state of not being seen to one of being seen, that is initially implicit and later translated into something explicit, that remains the same without any distinction, unaltered and unopposed, altering only in its form. So we have a hylomorphic account of agency. He says, quote, action is itself a content only when, in this determination of its simplicity, it's contrasted with its character as transition, as movement. We understand the content by understanding the two forms that it contakes. The concept of action is also structured essentially by the distinction and difference between the forms of not being seen and being seen, being implicit as purpose and explicit as achievement, and of the transition or movement by which the content develops from one such state or form to the other. The moments of identity and difference, the unity and disparity that action involve, are both crucial aspects of the concept of agency. So how are we to understand that? One natural way to think about the aspects of unity and disparity that action essentially involves is in terms of the distinction between success and failure. Judgment and belief essentially involve the acknowledgement of responsibility as to how things actually are, how they objectively are, how they are in themselves. Apart from their liability to normative assessment as to their correctness, in the sense of truth or error, states and performances are not intelligible as cognitively significant. Intention exhibits the complementary direction of normative fit, for it essentially involves the assertion of authority over how things actually, objectively, are to be. Apart from their liability to normative assessment as to their correctness in this sense of success or failure, states and performances are not intelligible as practically significant. Practically sorting performances into successful and unsuccessful doings is implicitly acknowledging the two aspects of the concept of action. The distinction that action implies between purpose and achievement is in play because these are the elements one must compare in order to assess success or failure. And the unity essential to the concept of action, the fact that endorsing a purpose, adopting it as one's own, is committing oneself to a norm according to which the achievement ought to be what one intends, is just what sets the normative standard for success. Disparity of purpose and achievement is failure in accomplishing what one intended to accomplish. Identity of purpose and achievement is success in accomplishing what one intended to accomplish. Since one cannot understand what intentional action is without understanding that such actions are essentially, and not just accidentally, subject to assessment as successful or failed, it follows that one cannot grasp the concept of intentional action without implicitly acknowledging the two aspects of that concept that Hegel distinguishes. So this is, I think, a very common sense sort of view. I don't think it's Hegel's view at all. On the familiar way of rendering these claims, the relations between the aspects of unity and difference that the concept of action involves has it that the question of whether those aspects are realized is to be answered differently for each particular performance. Some succeed, some fail. That is to say that the relation between the aspects is understood as local, as contingent, and as disjunctive. It's local in that the assessment of success or failure is made for each action, one by one. It exhibits identity of content of purpose and achievement in case it succeeds, and difference of content of purpose and achievement in case it fails. The possibility of disparity and the ideal of identity of content between purpose and achievement are universal, but those features are each actualized only in some actions. It's contingent whether any particular action succeeds or fails. For instance, whether as intended I put the ball through the hoop. And the two aspects are disjunctively related, indeed related by exclusive disjunction, because for any given action, either the action succeeds and so exhibits the identity of content of purpose and content of achievement, or it fails and so exhibits their disparity. I'll call this sort of account an LCD view, local contingent disjunctive view of the identity and difference that structures the concept of action. The LCD shape of account is so commonsensical, it can be hard to so much as conceive of an alternative to it. Nonetheless, I don't think that it's a view of this shape that Hegel is expressing. According to the Post-Davidsonian way of thinking about agency I've been attributing to Hegel, the identity and difference that structures the concept of action is rather global, necessary, and conjunctive. Assessment of success or failure in the ordinary sense, what I'll tendentiously call vulgar success or failure, is, if not completely irrelevant to understanding the unity and disparity that action involves, at any rate something that comes into the story only very much later. According to a GNC, global necessary conjunctive account, every action, globally, as an action, necessarily, both, conjunctively, simply translates something inner or implicit into something outer or explicit, hence exhibiting the unity of action and the identity of content in two different forms, and necessarily involves an actual disparity between purpose and achievement, what Hegel calls the distinction that action necessarily involves. The disparity that action necessarily involves is the social perspectival distinction of loci of authority that distinguish between Handlung and Tat. The endorsed, acknowledged purpose of the agent that the agent is authoritative about, in virtue of which what happens is an action at all, and the consequential specifications that necessarily outrun any specification of purpose available in advance of the actual doing. This is the distinction between what one intended that one do and what one thereby intended of that one do that. It's the distinction between de dicto and de re specifications of the doing. The unity that action necessarily involves is the unity of content that takes these two forms. Hegel says, action itself is a content only when, in this determination of simplicity, it's contrasted with its character as transition and as movement between the two forms that one content can take. In intending in actual circumstances that one make true the claim that P, there's always something of which one thereby intends to do that. These are two normative perspectives on one action, the intentional and the consequential. Cf. what Hegel called the two aspects possessed by the practical consciousness, intention and deed. The content of the action can be specified either de dicto, that, in terms of the purpose that authorized it, or de re, of, in terms of what was thereby in fact authorized. Understanding the concept of action requires understanding actions as unities that necessarily involve this distinction of perspective, and understanding those perspectives as perspectives on one content. The content of the intention, in Hegel's use of Absicht, is the content of the action. The intention that, as a norm, governs the process of achieving an end can be thought of as a universal content discernible in all phases of that process, from implicit initial subjective endorsing of the end to its explicit objective achievement. The purpose and the accomplished deed are then two perspectives on that one content. This Vorsatzabsicht distinction gives Hegel a theoretical way of saying what vulgar success and failure of actions consists in. An action succeeds in this sense if the consequential descriptions that are true of it include the purpose whose achievement is the endorsed end, in the service of which all the other elements of the intention plan function as means. An action fails in this sense if, although some things are done intentionally, that is, as part of the plan, the purpose is not achieved because the means adopted did not have the consequences envisaged. But even an action that fully succeeds in this sense, in which the actual process unfolds through the successive realization of subsidiary ends serving as means to the realization of the final purpose exactly as intended, even an action that fully succeeds in this sense still necessarily exhibits the disparity that action involves. For even in such a case, there remains the distinction between Handlung and Tat, between the constellation of realized descriptions under which what is done is intentional, and the deed, comprising the whole panoply of consequential descriptions, unfolding to the infinite future, which, whether originally envisaged or not, were not elements of the intentional structure, but are elements of what one did in realizing that intention. So at this point, we can see the rationale behind the global, necessary conjunctive reading of the structure of identity and difference, characteristic of agency, on Hegel's hylomorphic view. The claim that every action, whether it's a success or a failure, in the vulgar sense that the motivating purpose or end aimed at was realized or not, every action exhibits both the unity and the disparity that action by its very concept involves. For at this point it should be clear how the combination of the Davidsonian reading of the Tat-Handlung distinction and a rendering of the distinction between success and failure in terms of the Vorsatzabsicht distinction together underwrite the claim that even fully successful actions necessarily exhibit the disparity that action involves. And conversely, even an action that fails in the vulgar sense exhibits the socially instituted perspectival unity, normative unity of action, the determination of a content, the content of a commitment on the one hand attributed and on the other hand acknowledged. Regarded prospectively, from the point of view of the initially endorsed purpose, the move from implicit to explicit is one of change. The content of the intention evolves and develops, becoming more definite and determinate under the influence of the actual circumstances in which the intention is realized, as plans are formulated, implemented, amended, and replaced. Regarded retrospectively, from the point of view of the finally achieved result, the move from implicit to explicit is one of the revelation of the content of an intention that was all along present, albeit in some sense, visibly only retrospectively, implicitly present. In the end, then, how does Hegel reconcile the two aspects, the unity and diversity that agency essentially involves? Here are the basic elements of the story I've told. At base, the story is hylomorphic. The unity and the diversity are two forms of one content. The forms are diverse. The content is common and unitary. Both aspects, both forms, are essential to the identity of the content. It's essential to it, and not just accidental, that the content, the Sache selbst, takes both these forms. The two forms are different specifications of one content. They turn out to correspond to de dicto and de re specifications of that content. The Davidsonian story is the beginning of understanding this. The post-Davidsonian aspects begin with the thought that the two forms are generated by different social perspectives on the action, that of the agent and that of the other community agent, of the other community members. The one who acknowledges and undertakes the responsibility, and the ones who attribute it. Further, these social perspectives are different loci of authority. They're generated by the context of deliberation on the one hand and the context of assessment on the other. This is the social perspectival normative deepening of the Davidsonian distinction between intentional and consequential specifications. The one content must have these two forms because it must be accessible from both perspectives. It must be accessible from both perspectives because normative statuses are instituted by reciprocal recognitive attitudes.